work. Okay, good evening. I'm Rear Admiral John Christensen, President of the Naval War College, and it is indeed a pleasure to welcome all of you. Tonight's presentation, the college's Contemporary Civilization lecture for this academic year, the first lecture of the year, is sponsored by our great friends in the Naval War College Foundation. Where's John Odegaard? John, on behalf of the Naval War College, to you and all of your great foundation, thank you. Tonight's lecture is in memory of Captain Robert N. Miller III, a Naval War College graduate and former faculty member through the generosity of Captain Miller's family. Recognized as one of the world's renowned futurists, Edie Weiner is president of Weiner, Edrich, Brown, Incorporated, a leading futurist consulting group. Since its founding in 1977, it has served over 400 clients from corporate, academic, and government sectors in identifying opportunities in the areas of marketing, product development, strategic planning, investments, human resources, and public affairs. Clients have ranged from the U.S. Congress to many of the Fortune 500. She is acknowledged as one of the most influential practitioners of social, technological, political, and economic intelligence gathering. Early in her career, Ms. Weiner was the youngest outside woman ever elected to a corporate board. She has been a guest lecturer at the Wharton Business School, Harvard University, the U.S. Army War College, and a number of other universities. Her articles have appeared in numerous publications, including the Harvard Business Review, the Futurist, and the Wall Street Journal. She has co-authored 4 books, including the widely read Future Think, which has been translated into multiple languages around the world. You will detect little hesitancy as she takes the stage because she has given keynote addresses to over 300 conferences. She serves on numerous boards and advisory panels, including the U.S. Comptroller General's Advisory Board. She was the first recipient of the Fashion Group International's Entrepreneur of the Year Award in 1998, now New York's 2011 Woman of Power and Influence Award, and the World Future Society's 2011 Lifetime Achievement Award. Okay, enough for the script. We brought you here to the Naval War College, you students. Thank you, faculty that's here, all our distinguished guests from the foundation that are here tonight, to help you think. The purpose of this college is to understand war, so hopefully we can prevent it. I went to the Fletcher School in Boston, and we believe 3 things there. That to prevent war, to understand war, you need to study economics, you need to study law, and you need to think. Well, for our evening lecture series this year, we're excited that later on this fall, we're going to have the CEO of General Electric up here to talk to you. That covers kind of the economic part of it. In the spring, we have one of our Supreme Court justices is going to be up on this stage to talk to you about law and a free democracy. So that leaves the thinking part. So our first lecture tonight, and hopefully what the rest of this year in Newport will bring to you, is the ability to think critically, to think hard, to work hard, to read and write, but to think hard. And obviously, we're not doing any of this. We want to understand the past. We want to understand today, but our job is to be ready for the future. So it's a great honor to help us do that, to help us teach you that. For our first lecture of the year, Edie Weiner, thank you for coming to the Naval War College to help us think.
Thank you, John. No, we're good. We're good. I don't know if I'm on. Can you hear me? We're good to go? Thank you, John. I have, frankly, my own philosophy when it comes to conflict. I believe that before you have a conflict with someone, first you should walk a mile in their shoes. That way, when you have the conflict, you'll be a mile away. And you'll have their shoes. To me, that's a win-win all the way around. I've been studying the future for over 40 years, about 44 years now. And it's been an interesting ride. And the question that I get asked very often is, do I have a crystal ball? Do I use entrails? How do I do this? The second, definitely not. The first, yes, but that's because I collect minerals and gems. What we have been doing for over 4 decades is a lot of reading, summarizing a lot of what we read, and then combing through all of those summaries to find underlying themes. Currently, and I'm saying currently, for the last 35 years, the way we've done it is we kind of stop the world once every 3 months. We look at everything we've summarized over the prior 3 months. We ask ourselves the question, if all we knew about the future were these last 3 months worth of readings, what would that tell us? And we force ourselves to come up with 6 new themes every quarter to help us understand the future. So that's kind of like the mental Olympics of trend analysis, because we generate 24 papers a year on emerging important themes. Having done this over decades, we have done hundreds of serious papers, and we have generated tens of thousands of abstracts, and not with computers, just with a handful of humans trying to figure this out. And so we've looked at social and economic and political and technological change, and they are not mutually exclusive. They all do feed into each other. And we've basically then come to a point where 10 years ago, after doing that for over 30 years, people started to ask us how we were getting everything so right. Even though we had our system in place, obviously, there were ways that we were thinking that were working. And so I kind of went back to the drawing board and thought, well, I know we have a system, and I know it's been working, but how has our thinking helped that system to work? We had so many people say, you should be computerizing this. You should be putting all this information on computers. Computers can tell you the trends once you put them all in. Well, I don't know about you, but I think there are a heck of a lot of computer models out there that haven't worked especially well, and we're still in business after 44 years. So it was something that was not computerizable. It was something that was about the way we are capable of thinking that helped us understand where the future was going. And I realized there were something like 30 different what we call thinking technologies, ways that we think. And they're not mutually exclusive. And the last book we did, Future Think, contained 16 of them. We don't have time to go into a lot of them tonight with you because I actually want to bring you into the future. So I'm going to go over with you the one that I think is by far the most important thinking technology. We call it the mother of all of the thinking technologies. And what it is the recognition of educated incapacity. And what is that? 2 words, educated incapacity. That simply means knowing so much about what you already know that you are the last to be able to see the future for it differently. We are all affected by educated incapacity. It's why we would never go to doctors to find out about the future of healthcare. We would never go to retailers to find out about the future of retailing, bankers to find out about the future of banking, or Army generals or Navy commanders to find out about the future of the military. I just want to make this one caveat, though. I think that the last category is probably less susceptible the more I get to know a lot of you people. But the fact is, this is epidemic and endemic, educated incapacity. Why does this happen? It happens because we begin learning from the time we are born. And lately I've been correcting myself and saying from the time we're conceived, because now parents are showing their embryos cue cards so they'll do better on the SATs. So we begin learning right from the get-go. And what we learn depends a great deal on who our parents and or guardians happen to be, the era into which we are born, the community to society into which we are born, what experiences we have, who we meet, the schools we happen to go to, the teachers we happen to get, what they choose to teach us. And this is compounded year after year after year. And then we grow up and we go into advanced studies, or we go into our work, or both, and we learn more and more and more, and we wake up one morning, come to this lecture, believing that our greatest asset, by far, is our knowledge. And it is a phenomenal asset, because it took us all of our lives to acquire it. But if you turn that asset over, it's also one of our greatest liabilities, because it is the most amount of baggage that we take with us everywhere we go, everything we know. And the problem is that having acquired this baggage all these years, paid everything for it, done everything we needed to get to it, we see it as Louis Vuitton. So of course we're taking it with us everywhere. And then all of a sudden we look over to our left side and to our right side, and there are those heading into the future with backpacks. Light, easy, fast, and bypassing us. And we're standing there with all of our Louis Vuitton saying, but I can't leave this. And they don't care, because they're just racing by with their backpacks. And so we hear a lot about the learning curve and how tough it is to get up on the learning curve. I believe that every single one of you in this room tonight could be a nuclear physicist if you wanted to be. Now, some of you may need a little more tutoring. But the fact of the matter is that given the time, putting in the effort, having the right teachers, you could all learn this. But I'll tell you what you can't do. You can't get on the forgetting curve very quickly. It's so hard to forget what we know, except when you get to a certain age, and then you have no choice over what you're forgetting. But lawyers know this. When they instruct, when they get testimony, and the judge instructs the jury to disregard the prior testimony. Oh, right. The lawyer knows that the jury can't forget what they've just heard. It's really very hard for us to do that. So forgetting is tough, and leaving everything we've acquired that means so much to us on the sidewalk and trading it for a backpack is also really tough. And there are only two living creatures that I can think of that don't suffer from educated incapacity to the extent that we do. And those are children and aliens from another planet. And in the end, though it may sound frivolous, the greatest job that we have in coming to objectivity, because you cannot see the future unless you are objective, the greatest difficulty we have is teaching our clients and our audiences to look through the eyes of a child or the eyes of an alien. And we actually call it alien eyes, and that's a kind of vocabulary that many of our clients use, seeing through alien eyes, something new for the very first time. Because then you can be objective and you don't bring all of your baggage with you. The world is changing rapidly, and we're going to get to that time issue shortly. But right now, I just want to drill home this issue of the way we see the world really depends on our own reality. Not anybody else's, but what we've been taught to think, what we choose to think and see. You all know that optical illusion of the vase or the urn. And when you look at that, that's what you see. But if you take that figure and you put it into the background, and you take the background and bring it into the foreground, what you see is the profile of two faces. You all know that optical illusion that I'm talking about. If you see the vase, then you see a market for pottery wheels and paint and glaze. But if you see the profile of two faces, you see a marketplace for cosmetic surgery. Nobody has changed the picture on you. You have changed your focus. And you have taken a look at what's in the background and brought that forward, as opposed to focusing on what you've been taught to, or what you prefer to, or what you choose to, or what you think you ought to. Which is why I don't like the cliche, think outside the box. I don't know if any of you know where that came from. Back in the 1960s, there was a puzzle that was 9 dots, 3 rows of 3 dots. And you had to connect all of those dots with straight lines, I think it's 4 or 5, without taking your pencil off the paper. And the only way you could solve that problem was to go outside the dots and come back in again. And all of a sudden, everywhere, the mantra was think outside the box. I think that that's unfortunate, because 99% of what we could see and should see is right there in the box. We are just not looking at it at all, because nobody taught us to, because we prefer not to, or we choose not to. So I'm going to do a little exercise with you. I'm going to make you a couple of bets, and I'm going to win, because I'm going to pit you against the alien from another planet. I'm going to ask you to picture in your mind's eye, those who make up the vibrant workplace of the armed forces right now. I want you to picture them in your mind's eye. I'm going to bet you that you pictured, for the most part, people between the ages of 25 and maybe 60, 55 or 60. Well, the interesting thing is that it's people who are 15 and 16 who are creating the technologies that are being adapted over time in a rolling age kind of thing that is running your ships, running your programs, running your decision-making capacity. We don't think about them as being in the armed forces, but they have actually increasingly governed everything that the armed forces does. The science and the technology of teenagers, and those who are 17 and 18. And then if we think about who should be in the armed forces, an alien coming down to Earth for the very first time with no educated incapacity would look around the world and realize that about 12 years ago, Italy became the first country in world history to have more people over 60 than under the age of 20, followed shortly thereafter by Germany, Greece, Turkey, Belgium, all of Eastern Europe. Japan is now the oldest nation on Earth. China has the inverted pyramid, 4 grandparents, 2 parents, 1 child. This aging situation in the industrialized world is gripping most of the industrialized world, with the exception of a few countries. One is the United States, and we have immigration to thank for that. Another is France, and that's because the majority of births in France now are Muslim. 2 others are Iceland and New Zealand, and that's because there's nothing else to do there. And that's what's true of what we used to call the industrialized world. In opposition to that is India, where about 40% of the population is under 17, and the Arab Middle East. So when we think about where we're going to get the talent for the armed forces over the next 5 years and 10 years, we are writing off huge swaths of the population that are increasingly living to be 100 years and increasingly productive up to at least the age of 85. We think about 65 as a general absolute retirement ending. It's younger in the armed forces in many cases. But 65 is when you butt up against the end of it all. Well, that's interesting. Do you know where that number comes from? Otto von Bismarck, the 1870s, the Prussian Empire. Basically, Otto looked at the mortality tables then, and I'm not sure which one he used because there were several kicking around, but basically, the average life expectancy of the adult male in the workforce or armed forces, no women included at all, was about 63. So Otto set 65 as retirement because he figured that if you made it to 63, you were entitled to a couple of months off before you dropped dead. It is 150 years later, and we are still living with that educated incapacity. The world has passed us by. Ages have passed us by. And when we look at people today who are 45, there is no reason why they cannot begin a 30-year career in the armed forces. Not only that, but there are people who are over 65 who have the language skills, the knowledge, and the intelligence of the cultures they came from. And they should be fully incorporated into the knowledge bases of our armed forces. But we don't think about that because our educated incapacity leaves us with an age range that we are stuck with from all of recent history without seeing what the alien sees in terms of what is going on, in terms of the aging of the populations everywhere. I'm going to make you another bet. I'm going to bet you that when I asked you to picture all those who made up the armed forces, you pictured people. An alien coming down to Earth for the very first time would realize that non-carbon life forms outnumber people in the armed forces by many thousands to one. You could not do what you do today without all the systems in place that do the work of thousands of people. And the interesting thing is that those systems are hired by technology experts. Human experts hire the people, when in fact they have to work as teams together. And the integration of what we call human resources and tech, TI, has to become much, much more effective if we are to move into the future. Because from an alien's perspective, these are two life forms working together. From our perspective, there's just people and machines and systems. So when we think about educated incapacity, switching figure and ground, what we focus on, what we don't focus on. A few other cases. If I talk to you about money, and I said, expand your definition of money, you might think of equities. You might think of debt instruments. But in fact, currency is a word that makes us think about government-issued money. That is the figure that we look at. If we put that in the background and bring true currency into the foreground, far more of an occurrence in this world, and the alien would see this immediately, is countertrade and barter. And let me ask you this question. What is the currency that is second most in circulation in the world today behind the US dollar? Does anybody know what it is? Reward points. And I promise you that that's not going to be a frivolous chuckle in the future, because more and more of the younger generation are living their lives based on trading up in points of one kind or another. And the currency that is most challenging the government of China currently, do you know what that is? Virtual currency. The currency that is generated in and used in virtual worlds, virtual gaming environments, spilling over into the main ground economy, above ground economy. And the government has no idea what to do with this, how to control this. And this currency is real currency. It has liquidity. It is traded on global markets. You can buy it from country to country, sell it from country to country. Virtual money buys real goods. Real money buys virtual goods, and back and forth. This is not the world of your grandparents at all. At all. And yet we're still thinking somehow it is. Somehow it is. Another example. If we were to focus on food, and that were our focus, then there are certain things we would do from the standpoint of security, the use of resources, the way we allocate a lot of the leverages in the system, the way we give subsidies, we're looking at food. But we know what has happened in the past 10 years, 6 years more specifically, when we started to divert arable lands for the purpose of growing crops for ethanol, so that people who could afford energy could pay less for it, while many in the world could no longer afford their food as a result. But what if instead of focusing on food, we put that in the background and we brought nutrition into the foreground? Well, that changes everything, because how do you subsidize for nutrition as opposed to food, the crops? And then what kinds of incentives are moved in the system, and how can you deliver nutrition in different and more effective ways? How can you make one food deliver 42 sources of nutrition? We will do that in the future. And then food and nutrition will become unbundled, and we'll be looking at a very different environment for all of our needs, including security. And then here's the last one I'm going to give you. This is a favorite of mine. What if instead of focusing in the center, when we think of the military, on waging war, to the notion of waging peace, not peacekeeping, not trying to dampen war? What would it mean if we militarily waged peace? If we brought down a rogue government by delivering to peoples what they needed, thereby undermining the rogue government? If in missiles we put payload that consisted of education and nutrition as opposed to things that blew up? It just becomes an interesting exercise mentally to think about aggressively waging peace. I don't have all the answers there, but I think as a puzzle, it becomes an interesting thing to think about. And what would the alien think? How would the alien construct a program of waging peace to bring down an unfriendly government? So when we think about figure ground, when we think about educated incapacity, our job always in our shop is to come to some objectivity, is to turn the tables, is to look at the other side, is to think in terms of opposites. It could be something as simple as looking at Toys R Us and saying, well, who's your market? Okay, children. Let's just take the opposite for a moment. Let's just flip it and say elderly people. Well, yeah, who's spending the money on the toys for their grandchildren? Maybe they are the primary market. And when you just switch your perspective, when you're willing to put your baggage down and walk away from it and look at something in a completely different way, whole new vistas open up, whole new possibilities. It's just so hard for us to forget and so difficult for us to leave our baggage behind. So I'm going to leave you with that one thinking technology, and there are many, many others, but that's the most important, because if you don't get educated in capacity, nothing else I tell you will matter. We kind of liken it to people who say, if all I need to do is win the lottery, and I'll be made for life. And so they stand online to win the lottery. If you know the statistics, more than half of the people who win the lottery are bankrupt a few years later. And that's because it has nothing at all to do with money. It has to do with having your head screwed on right about money, in which case you probably didn't have to win the lottery in the first place. And the same thing is true of the future. I could tell you what's going to happen in the future. By the way, we don't do predictions. So I'm not going to tell you on this day at this time. You can call 1-800-PSYCHIC if you're interested in that. And we don't call presidential races, and we don't call horse races. But I can give you a sense of what is going to be out there in the future. And that's pretty easy for us to do. But if your head's not screwed on right, you're not going to get it. You're not going to get it. And that's why understanding educated incapacity comes before everything else. It's just about getting your head screwed on right. So now let's take a look at where we're heading. We have not been, as far as I'm concerned, in a recession. We are not in a recession. There is no issue of recovery. There is no issue of jobless recovery. There is no issue of the second dip. This is because economists, for the most part, suffer from educated incapacity. What we have been seeing was something that we projected back in 1992 would happen beginning in 2005. And that's because we were studying something in 1992 that was, again, a break from the past. We are in a fundamental global economic transformation. This is not a cyclical recession. And this is not the first time we have been through this fundamental transformation. If we go back through history, we know that we went from the agricultural era to the industrial era, based on a confluence of technologies that ranged from machines that could do much of the farm work to the railroads that could bring food to market. And those railroads depended upon whole new technologies and helped to spur us into the industrial economy that then, after World War II, became the post-industrial economy based on a confluence of technologies that were developed after World War I, during World War II, and then put into commercial use. And it was that confluence of technologies that created the post-industrial society. And then in 1992, we saw that a whole new set of technologies were coming along. And all of those companies and businesses that were supposed to be the companies and businesses of the future were now laying off a lot of people. Those were the Nippon Telephone and Telegraph, AT&T, Xerox. And so in 1992, we did the hard job of trying to figure out what was going on here. And we realized that these transformations had taken place before because of the confluence of technologies. That made everything that was done earlier much more efficient, therefore not needing as many people to do those things. Then they would go on and create whole other businesses that had nothing to do with their original efficiencies. So that basically all of the machines that create efficiencies in agriculture went on to build washing machines and dryers and hair blowers, and that had nothing to do with agriculture. But it was part of the industrial. This is the real story. We were tens of thousands of years in the agricultural era. We were 200 in the industrial. We were 45 in the post-industrial, when in 1992 it was clear that another was happening. We named it the immotile economy, and I'm not going to go into it yet, except to say that the 5 growth areas we projected were right on target, including, by the way, the enormous amount of money spent on security and terrorism. But we knew in 1992 that given this compounded rate of change, we were lucky if we had till 2005 before the new economy would start to rear its head and create all kinds of dislocations in labor again. We were pretty much right on the money, because what had happened was that we were creating with the new technologies so many more efficiencies, yet again. A year later, financial shenanigans in the global gridded financial marketplace, high risk, basically a house of cards, fell apart. Those two situations coincidentally came together. And everybody then pointed to that financial falling apart as a recession and the reason to have to let go a lot of people. And the reason those jobs never came back is because it wasn't a recession. It's because it was a fundamental restructuring and they were going to go away anyway. And they weren't going to come back anyway. And so the hard job now is to figure out how we can very quickly reemploy massive numbers of people who are no longer needed. Here in the United States, we are still an agricultural economy. Make no mistake about that. But we only need 2% of our working population to actively be employed in agriculture. Here in the United States, we are still an industrial economy, but we only need 13% of our working population employed there. What's going on here? What's going on here is that we don't displace economies. We layer them on top of each other because we need food. We need industrial output. We need the services that were created in the post-industrial environment. We just don't need the people there. So we're not organized around that. So while we are still those economies, we are not that society, and we move on. And so here is where we're going. I'm giving you a 25-hour lecture in 15 minutes. Here is where we are heading. We are heading into what we call the metaspace economy. And we've identified 6 major growth areas ahead. And we will have to really understand how all of these fit in to where national security and the armed forces are going in the future, because this is where the world is going in the future. These 8 growth areas are all about some aspect of space. Very quickly across the 8, they are inner space, outer space, cyberspace, time space, design space, green to blue space, storage space, and microspace. So let's take them very quickly one at a time so you understand them. Inner space is the imaging of, I'm going to say for our purposes here today, the human brain. It's actually understanding what makes living things tick, all kinds of living things, including animals. And by the way, they will be used more and more in the armed forces of the future. We are learning how to communicate more with animals and how they do certain things. One of the most recent discoveries was that Australian sharks are actually calmed by listening to heavy metal AC/DC music. I don't know who paid for that research, but it's certainly interesting. So, we are looking at a time where we will be doing more and more of imaging of the human brain. And as we image the human brain, we are finding out more about what makes us tick and the differences and the similarities. And one of the things we know is that we all have uniquely different brains. No 2 people have the same brain. Some people have very generous brains, for example, and even under the worst of circumstances, their brains are kicking out the positive neurotransmitters, the dopamines and the endorphins that make them feel really good. Some people have very stingy brains. And even under the best of circumstances, their brains are not doing anything happy. There has never been a correlation between productivity and happiness. None. There are lots of very happy people who hang out at the water cooler all day and get nothing done. There's a lot of miserable SOBs who are highly productive. So in the end, don't ever really lose a lot of time worrying about whether the people you command or the people you work with are happy or unhappy. And as leaders, and as the future leaders that many of you will become, just know that your major responsibilities as a leader is to make sure that every single one of the people who work with and for you are treated with respect, are treated fairly, and that the obstacles are removed from their ability to doing their jobs to the best of their ability. Their happiness is their problem, not yours. So we know that in mapping the brain. We also know that there are huge physiological distinctions between the male and the female brain. Now, many of us have known that for years without scientists telling us. But now they're confirming some of the things that we thought was so. And when we study those differences, it becomes really interesting. In a nutshell, it turns out that we all begin life with a female brain, and within 5 to 6 weeks after conception, the male embryo has a much higher dose of testosterone shot through it, and it goes off and develops differently as a male, which not only affects its body development, but also its brain development. The female goes on to develop 10 to 20 million more connections in the corpus callosum between the left and the right hemisphere, making her brain very integrated. The male brain becomes much more specialized with a different kind of spatial capacity. The second time that differentiation occurs is in adolescence, which is the second time the male organism has a much higher dose of testosterone shot through it, at which point you start to see the imbalance of more boys having pimples than girls, more boys beginning to exceed in the higher levels of math and science on average, not leaving all girls behind. Many of those can succeed too, but on average, and then starting all the problems in the world that we're left to clean up. So, we know that sensorially we are different, and we know, for example, from some of the latest research, that if you image the male brain, you find that financial risk-taking lights up the same centers and is coordinated with the same brain centers as sex. In the female brain, financial risk-taking and sex are completely separated. Who do you want taking care of your money? As we do more imaging of the human brain, we find out over time more and more about what makes us tick, what we may have in common, what may be different, and there's no question but that that's going to be used in all areas of defense and security, because we can now know when someone is lying very easily. We can now know when someone has the potential of bad intentions. We can't know everything, and we won't, because in our lifetimes we will not map the entire human brain. There are more connections in the human brain than there are stars in the universe. But we'll be able to make a lot of inferences from what we do understand. And then we move from inner space to outer space. And clearly, we are seeing huge growth in what's going on in outer space. We know that space is becoming privatized, taken away from governments increasingly, because governments can't afford to go there, and put into private hands. And a lot of it is wild, wild west, and some of it is very exciting, and there's a lot of science going on there. And you may know that Branson's got his list of people who have paid a fortune to go up into space, and they likely will. So we look at outer space from the point of view of exploration, and what we are learning from some of the newest devices that we have sent up out into the universe is astounding, and that will bring back information to us that will teach us about parts of the light spectrum and energy that we had no clue about. And I'll touch on that just a little bit later. And then we have all of this issue about extraterrestriality and extraterrestrial intelligence, which is clearly becoming a huge commercial growth area for the future, and has been for a while. And you can see that in terms of the movies, the books, and so on. But you're going to see and hear a lot more of that. So then we move from outer space to time-space. And this is the leveraging of time and space. And we're going to be paying a lot more attention to what quantum physics says about time, and the fact that time is not linear, that it goes in waves and cycles and turns in on itself. And that understanding of time is going to affect a lot of our other understandings of the universe and the workings of the universe, and it will change a lot of what we do in terms of research and discovery. And then, and there's a lot more to it. I'm just skipping over these very, very quickly now. From time space, we go to design space. And design is becoming one of the most important leverageable differentiators for the future. You will increasingly see schools offering courses in design. You will, as an armed forces, increasingly value people who are excellent designers. Good, really good design thinking is going to be one of the most important skills as we go forward, because the more we know sensorially about the brain, the more we will understand how design will attach itself to the best use of everything that we put out there. and how it will also trick and fool, as with cloaking technology, which, by the way, is increasingly coming on the scene. So we have design space. We have green to blue space. What is that? We all talk about green, but doing green is increasingly a yawn. Everyone is expected to do green. So we move along the spectrum to being green. Being green requires that from the ground up, every process, everything we do, leaves the smallest possible negative footprint, carbon, water, any other. This is extremely difficult to do, and it almost means you have to invent something from scratch. But the really innovative areas of the future will come from blue. And blue is putting back more than you took. Now that's really exciting. What are we talking about here? I don't know if any of you have ever heard of ecotecture. The thought is that if you could take a spruce tree that would otherwise grow to 70 feet and bring it inside and train it as a bonsai, then you can grow a park bench. You don't need to build it. In fact, you can grow a house. And if you grew a house with genetically engineered, fast-growing, deep-rooted trees, that house would be more earthquake and hurricane resistant than anything that was built on the land, and put back more than was took. You're going to hear a lot more about urban and near-urban and vertical and horizontal farming, because for the first time in human history in the last decade, we have more people living in cities than not living in cities. This has never been the case before in human history. When we think about these megacities around the world, one of the most destabilizing things that we have to look forward to is their need for water and their need for food/nutrition. And that's why I like to think about nutrition rather than food. Because as we begin to grow food in cities, we can do it more effectively in ways where we focus on the kinds of technology, lighting, sensing, water reuse, energy reuse, that maximizes the nutrition that we get from the food that we grow in these new environments. So when we think about blue, that becomes really a whole other area for exploration and discovery. And then storage space. Why is this becoming such an important growth area for the future? Well, we are running out of room for our personal junk. The private storage space business is one of the fastest growing businesses in this country. We are running out of room for e-waste. This is a planetary problem and will cause instability, because we have so much e-waste that we don't know what to do with, and it is so pollutive because we just keep throwing out perfectly good refrigerators and ovens and cell phones and computers and replacing them with the newest models. And we just keep throwing those away and replacing them yet again. And we have no place to put this stuff. So we illegally ship it to China, and then we're shocked that it comes back in toys. But this is a global issue, and we're going to have to confront this. And those that come up with the solutions to the storage of e-waste, or the recycling of it, the reuse of it, will be rewarded, clearly, economically. And then we move to the ability to store things in our brains. We have so much, we know so much, we're just running out of room to store things in our brains. Data storage, big issue. So much data. Zettabytes, yettabytes, and things that you haven't even heard about, that are numbers with zeros that are so many you can't even count. And that's the amount of data that we're generating now, and the storage problems are going to be significant. GE, and Jeff Immelt is going to be talking to you later in the season. GE is working, for example, on holographic chips so that we can store data in 3 dimensions in a very different way. So storage space. And then microspace. And this is nanotechnology at the molecular level, 3D printing. How many of you have been following what's going on with 3D printing? Okay, that's a shame. You all have to, because this is going to completely revolutionize the future. We can now, in a portable device, basically using something like an inkjet printer, print anything in your living room. This pair of glasses, the microphone I'm wearing, the pen that I used to jot down these notes. And very soon, pharmaceuticals, human body parts, already doing it with food. And I would suggest all of you just check out, those of you who did not raise your hand, check out, for example, MakerBot. I think MakerBots are now down under $1,000. And there are whole communities purchasing these things, using them, making things, and this will completely change the entire industrial model. And when it does, issues like trade negotiations will be very, very different. Protection of intellectual property rights will be very, very different. And so many of the other economic issues that stabilize and destabilize the world will be very different because we will all be manufacturers and we will all be making so many things for ourselves. So we're coming up to shortly my official remarks, and then getting questions from you. So I just want to touch on run through a few facts very quickly so you can get a gestalt of what's happening here. I just mentioned Microspace. Let me run through a few things that we've seen in the past few years alone. Acoustic waves from rap music, applying force to polymers in water, and the beating of a human heart, all are potentially able to power small electronics. A tiny paper-thin sensor can be tattooed onto teeth and act as an early detector of disease. Sensors implanted inside the human brain can allow for the mental control of objects. A recent idea for Mercedes-Benz, the Biome Car. It's an ultra-lightweight vehicle that starts with seeds that fuse with the company's star logo and then literally grow to form a car in the laboratory. The car is expected to be completely biodegradable and to collect its needed energy from the sun. There is now a DNA computer which can calculate square roots. DNA, genetic material. DNA computing uses chemical reactions to solve problems in which a number of DNA strands act as bits. That's the fusing of genetics and atoms. What I'm describing to you now, all of these, and what I will continue to give you a few other examples are, of what we call bang fuel. Now, don't pass out. Bang fuel is BAANGFUEL, and what it stands for is bits, atoms, antimatter, neurons, genes, frequencies and vibrations, and ultra and infraspectral energy/light. Are you still with me? I tell you that because the future in microspace is all about the combination and recombinations of these into materials and entities that we have never, ever before seen in history at all. So I've just given you some examples of DNA and bits and so on. A device about the size of a dime can manipulate living materials, including blood cells and entire small organisms, by using sound waves instead of touch. It's called acoustic tweezers. Entanglement, something that we know from particle physics, is the effect of one object connecting to another so that even if they're separated by large distances, an action performed on one will affect the other. It usually occurs with subatomic particles, but now scientists have linked two diamonds with entanglement. And in other recent experiments, quantum information has leapt through the air about 100 kilometers, bringing long-distance quantum communications networks closer to reality. We look at the time frame in which all of this is collapsing, how quickly it is happening. We call this templosion, the implosion of time into tiny amounts. A few examples. The average lifespan of a Fortune 500 company now may be 15 years. New stars like Borders, Circuit City, and Blockbuster are already fading and gone. The way venture capital is now raised, companies can be big fast and then gone fast. People can get rich, close down, move on, and huge corporations employ so few people that they can die with few labor consequences. The time it takes young computer gurus to raise large amounts of money has collapsed. A 13-person team was recently acquired for $1 billion without any revenue in a deal that took about 48 hours. YouTube's top comedic personalities quickly gained millions of viewers, rivaling the audience sizes of established networks. Flow, that effortless focus that is gained after about 10,000 hours of practice. Well, now DARPA is working on using transcranial direct current stimulation to quickly accelerate that, forming new neural pathways, and you only need a few hours, not 10,000. Hackers take down huge official websites, even those of governments, in ever shorter amounts of time. Words have been dying more often in the past 10 to 20 years than they have in all time measured before. Whole languages now require only one generation to drastically evolve. And for some of you who think that English is spreading around the world, think again. It is Englishes. There are many Englishes, no one English anymore. In less than 10 years, since 2007, the Arctic is becoming completely transformed into a new global shipping route. And if you don't think that's going to affect global security, you are totally wrong. Quantum computing is advancing at a geometrically accelerating pace. I didn't mistakenly repeat that word. It is progressing at a geometrically advancing pace. Quantum computing. So, clearly, we need imagination, innovation, and leadership if we are going to get to this future as fast as the future is getting to us. But I want to stop a moment and objectively look at those three words, because I hate cliches and I don't want you to fall into the trap of them. If we say imagination, what are we talking about? We say, yes, it's great. Imagination is great. Well, it is. There is the imagination that we had when we watched Flash Gordon and Walt Disney and Star Trek. And that led us to create so much of what we did in later years in terms of lasers and transporters and the idea of devices that can diagnose us and go to places off the Earth's gravity. All of that is about imagination, but so is the terrorist who imagines that there will be many, many virgins waiting for him in heaven. And so is the imagination of a guy who walks into a movie theater and shoots up everybody because he imagines himself to be a supervillain. Imagination is both positive and negative. And so is innovation. Innovation by itself is not a great word, because we do have the wonderful innovations that bring us everything that we have in modern life. But there was also the innovation of building a financial empire on risky, crazy, arbitraged instruments that brought down a whole financial system. That was innovation. It was highly innovative. And then when we talk about leadership, does that word say positive, wonderful, great? Well, let's examine that. Because I put two names on a piece of paper when I think of leadership: Mother Teresa and Adolf Hitler. And the only way that you can truly define leadership is to figure out what those two people had in common. And I could only find three things, although somebody told me there was a fourth, and that was a mustache. But I could only find three things that those two people had in common. The first was a vision and a passion for that vision. Passion for that vision. The second was the ability to articulate in words and or deeds that passion, so much so that disinterested people would follow. Now that's really important, and that's why I don't consider The heads of many organizations' leaders, they are managers, they are executives. But if people didn't follow them, they'd be fired. Leaders have the capacity to get disinterested people to buy into their vision and want to be there, want to go with them. So a good leader of an organization has people knocking on the doors to get into that organization, not just following because otherwise they'd be punished. And then third, they have, wait a minute, that was the third. They have the vision, the passion, the ability to articulate it such that disinterested people will follow. And I was so hurrying that I think that was the third. All right, it is the passion, it's the vision, the passion, and the ability to get disinterested people. Those are the three things that they have in common. I've been talking so fast, I'm sorry, I'm swallowing my words and my thoughts, and I'm way ahead of myself. So the point is this, that there's leadership, there is leadership, and we know what makes up leadership. And then we have to decide, is someone a leader that we want to follow or that we don't? Most of the books that have been written about leadership in the last 4 decades, and there are thousands of them, there are thousands of books written on leadership, are really mostly about what people would like leaders to be, not what leaders are. So we have to be really very careful about that and understand what we would like our leaders to be, but not mistake that for leadership. Because we will see many more leaders coming along in the future that are not what we would like leaders to be. So in the end, the last comment, the last point I want to make here, this is where my mind was racing to, because this is the most important point, is this. There are equal amounts of good and bad imagination, equal amounts of good and bad innovation, and equal amounts of good and bad leadership. Equal amounts. But the good side, good innovation, good imagination, good leadership faces bureaucracy, budget restrictions, short-term timeframes, regulatory and legislative boondoggles. That's what the good leadership faces. The bad leadership, the bad innovation, the bad imagination, no obstacles. That can just go out and do what it wants to do. The megalomaniacs, the criminals, the terrorists, they face no obstacles. So if you just do the math and you realize that we're equal on both sides, but the bad has no opposition and the good faces all of this, we have such a need to do so much more on the good side of imagination, innovation, and leadership. It is an urgent need because we are rushing so fast into the future and the math is not catching up with what is going on. So I'm going to leave you with that. We have about 15 minutes for questions, and so I want to answer any questions you may have about anything I talked about or anything I didn't speak about. We have one there.
Good evening, ma'am. Andrew Sylvia, United States Navy. Another thing that Mother Teresa and Adolf Hitler had in common sometime in their lives, they were both Roman Catholic. So my question to you, what is your firm's take on organized religion in the future?
Every time we go through a major fundamental transformation, what happens is that technologies begin this. They cause it. And what the technologies do is they change the economics of the situation. And as a result of that, they change the society organized around that, and that actually changes religion. So we think that these religions, the way they are currently defined, are old or traditional. They are not. Religion is constantly being redefined and reshaped. When we went from the hunter-gatherer society to the agricultural, as an example, We went from polytheism to monotheism because it was very important for people to basically, I want not theism, but we used the religion to move toward monogamy as opposed to polygamy. Why? Because there was suddenly land, there was ownership. And men had to know who their children were because that was who was going to inherit the land, who had to work the land. In hunter-gatherer societies, there was no inheritance. So there was basically, that was a matrilineal sort of approach. So religion was bent to favor monogamy, and all of the world's religions then started to preach more along the lines of monogamy. When we went from the industrial to the post-industrial society, Genesis changed. Genesis had been defined before in the industrial society as man giving God dominion over the earth and all of its resources, making man smartest so that he could exploit whatever was there. When we moved from the industrial to the post-industrial, in the late 50s and 60s, we started to see massive changes away from dominion and towards stewardship. Basically, that God gave man stewardship for the earth and all its resources, so that it would be returned to future generations in better shape than it was found. The difference between dominion and stewardship is night and day, but dominion served the industrial economy. Stewardship was better serving an economy that was moving away from that kind of environment. So everywhere we look around the world, religions change. They change all the time. They are living, breathing beings. And there is no religion that has been untouched or unchanged through all time. So as we head into the future, we see, for example, in Africa, in South America, fusions of religion from tribal roots or cultural beginnings fused with new and different kinds of religions. One of the things that we project, frankly, is that in about 15 years from now, two of the major tensions in the world will be Hispanic Christianity in the United States as opposed to European Islam. That never existed before. That never existed before. So there is nothing stagnant about religions. They change just as everything else does. Do we have another question? Please.
I'm Lieutenant Commander Kibriya from Bangladesh Navy. Ma'am, please help me. Help me imagine the world. How would it look like once all those innovations and changes that you foresee and you talked about, while the human basic instincts still remain the same? How would the world look like?
What would war look like? Is that what you're...
Yes.
What will the world or what will war look like?
The world.
The world?
Yeah.
What will the world look like? If you look at the... That's an easy question. People are already evolving. So if you look at human beings that populate the world, an anthropologist who has studied this might conclude that over the past 20 years, we have gone through already enormous phases of human evolution, which is what the life form that we know of as the more advanced species before before software came along. So we're wetware. Humans are part of the wetware of this planet. And we have evolved in many ways. For example, the crossbreeding of races all around the world is increasing at a very rapid pace. Here in the United States, probably about 10% or more of the population cannot claim a race of origin. So, and then if you take the unopposed males in China and India and other parts of Asia, where in China and India alone, you have tens of millions of young males unopposed by females because of female infanticide. You know that they're going to have to blend, move out of their own culture, bring brides in from elsewhere, or do whatever they can if they want a family. But increasingly in some of those countries, like Japan, they're going to technology. So I didn't get into cyberspace, by the way. You just reminded me. That was one of the 8 space propositions, which we never got to. But in cyberspace is where a lot of people are finding love and family in increasing parts of the world, because there are no females to oppose them. So if you looked at the world of some of the people in it, it's really bizarre compared to what you knew. They base, in Japan, there are images on cell phones of women who all look the same, but they love you more depending upon how much real money you spend on virtual flowers, virtual perfume, virtual chocolates, virtual dinners. There is a hotel, a boutique hotel there, that when you check in with your virtual lover, they actually acknowledge that you are with someone else. And so they give you a room with a double bed, and you have a big screen so you can project your virtual lover on that. You make reservations in a restaurant, and they're reservations for 2. So they know you're a little weird, but they, you know. As we look at the future of, like, you know, relationships and family in the world and that social fabric, there are things going on that never before in history ever were there. If we look at other forms of evolution of that human, as we look at what the world is going to look like, we work 24/7 now. Our bodies, our animal bodies, not designed for that. We have basically melatonin and serotonin, and we need that balance. And what we're doing is we are throwing the melatonin completely out by being up way past darkness. So we're evolving to make sense of that. We're evolving in terms of our brains because the work that we do is different. So the human that inhabits the earth is becoming a different kind of a human, a different kind of a species. That was never here. Combined with what I said earlier about non-carbon life forms, the intelligence inhabiting the Earth is becoming very, very different. From a geopolitical perspective, you have the declining relevance of nation states. And this is really important and interesting. The nation state is declining in relevance for 4 major reasons. 1, information does not respect man-made lines drawn anywhere around a map. It can go wherever it wants. 2, economics does not respect man-made lines drawn around the map. 3, migration, massive migration and immigration patterns are changing countries into whole other countries where they are increasingly majority minority and don't even have the majority of what they consider to be their indigenous populations. And 4, environmental problems and solutions do not respect man-made lines drawn around the. So, given the fact that the relevance, the irrelevance of sovereign states is declining, but like dinosaurs dying, they will not give up that power. But we still have to look at what other boundaries are coming along to replace that. And one of them we clearly see is religion, religious affiliations that are geopolitical. For example, the Balkanization of Eastern Europe, or the nation of Islam that cuts horizontally across the globe. So religion is playing much more of a geopolitical role in what we're looking at. And the interesting thing to us, when we first started talking about this, Henry Kissinger had come out with his book on looking at world situation. And in the appendix, the word religion does not appear at all. So this is something that, even in recent history, we did not acknowledge as a major factor in understanding what the world would look like in the future. Then if you take a look at things like reforestation, some of the things that some countries are doing to put things back right. On the other hand, you look at China that is damming up waters so that it can have more water flow, potentially causing huge issues with its neighboring countries. We're looking at water being a major issue for the future, for security, but potentially technology will resolve that. So I'm just going to end there to say that I have no idea how a sane person answers the question, what is the world going to look like in the future? But I've given you a few samples of some of the things that we're looking at. Yeah?
Lieutenant Commander Mike Mullen, U.S. Navy. I was just curious, what do you guys assess to be, say, in the next 50 to 100 years, the major threats to mankind?
Well, first the question is, will mankind exist when all the research now says that womankind is going to take over? Now, actually, the interesting thing is that some of the latest things that are coming out with 3D printing is the fact that we can actually 3D print sperm and we don't need men. So that's a 50 to 100 year projection. I think that we are already moving from wetware to software and ultimately even beyond that. When I say energy to you, when I say energy, with our educated incapacity, what do you think of? You think of the traditional sources of energy. You think of petroleum. You think of, perhaps if you move on, solar, geothermal, wind. But the fact is that everything is energy. Everything is energy. And we have made such inefficient use of such few resources that when you think about the future of humanity, I'm going to give you a different word. If you think about the future of humanity, we will probably be pulling energy from so many sources and able to do so many things completely unfettered, not only by geography or possibly by time, but also by our own bodies and also by our own current abilities. And the work that's being done in laboratories now is already having people being able to move things with their mind, to be able to use mental energy. And I cited that kind of what sounded like a frivolous example of all the sources that we can pull energy on from now, that can now power small things, but over time bigger and bigger things. So we will be living in a world that is so different from ours, because what we thought of as the sources of energy will be seemingly like prehistoric, compared to our ability to draw on energy everywhere and not even be confined by what we are physically in doing that. Yes?
John Roderick, Customs and Border Protection. I had a question about immigration and integration. You spoke on populations getting older, leadership being both positive and negative, which I saw was a question of ethics, and the math that we don't have a lot of time. So given that you mentioned the reduction in nation states, what should we be looking with immigration and integration? Should we have borders?
You know, I'm not going to answer the question of should we have borders. That's a judgment call. That's your opinion, and everybody can have a different opinion. But what I will say is that clearly the borders are less relevant in many ways and more relevant in some other ways. If we're moving into a global environment where intellectual property becomes extremely important, then we have to have bodies of law that are very different in the 21st century than what we had in order to value goods. Intellectual property requires bodies of law. Bodies of law require people to buy into those. You need governments to buy into those. Therefore, boundaries with sovereign governments that can make laws and police laws become very important, because without boundaries, you don't have those decisions made and you don't have the ability to police those decisions. So boundaries become important even as they disappear because intellectual property knows no boundaries. So those are the paradoxes that are out there. Now, in terms of integration of people, you know, I see 42 ways that that is increasingly happening, and I see a dozen ways that that's creating pullback and problems. The xenophobia that's taking place in Europe now is really interesting because the majority of births now are immigrant populations as opposed to native populations. We have called this country, the world has called this country the United States of America. An alien coming down from another planet with no educated capacity would call it the Universal States of America, not the United States. We had to fight a war to keep these states together. I don't know that we would fight that war again if that didn't exist already. But we are made up of people from everywhere all over the world. And that is what this country is made up of. And it's so funny when we hear about the integration of immigration populations or cultures, and people say it's changing it would change your culture or do it. Well, what makes up culture? What makes up culture? Food. What do we eat here in the United States? Bagels, sushi, burritos, pizza. Okay, so let's think about clothes. What makes, clothing is a very important part of what makes up culture and integration. Well, where do we source our fashion from? Milan, Paris, Japan, Russia, the East Village. Okay, so let's talk about music. Music is a form of culture. Where do we source our music from? We have jazz, we have stuff out of Africa, we have hip hop, we have then moved to Rasta, moved to Anglo-European, moved to salsa. We could go on and on. So in the end, language. Well, yeah, we speak English, but that didn't come from here, that came from another country. Although I jokingly say that those of us from Brooklyn speak it better. So in the end, we have had, our whole history is the experience of removing those kind of boundaries, those kind of geopolitical, geosocial boundaries, and merging it within this country. But even in this country, what is happening is that it's not about immigrant populations, and it's not about racial or ethnic background anymore. It's about class. There is a class divide in this country that is pretty much colorblind, but is economic and education attuned. And people are moving to neighborhoods where they agree with the people who live there. So as opposed to the first waves of immigration, where people just moved where they were and they lived with people who had all different values, what's happening now is that people are electing to live in like-minded communities. And that's one of the reasons that we're having tougher and tougher times getting people to speak to each other. So that's what's going on here, and we have all of this body of blending and immigration. So it's going to be a tough haul for some of the rest of the world. So John is here. My time is up. He's telling me I'm done. And I hope this was a worthwhile evening for you. I know I had fun meeting so many of you and getting to know you. Thank you for having me here. Stay up here.
Well, thank you all. Edie, we have a small token of our appreciation for your wonderful thoughts. You revealed at the end that you were from Brooklyn. We should have known it would take a New York City woman to get us thinking hard. This book was written by Professor Chris Demchek. It's called Wars of Disruption and Resilience. About 80 years ago, this college became famous for thinking about the next war. And we knew that air power would play big. We weren't quite sure how. We had no vision of Pearl Harbor or Midway or atom bombs, but we knew it was going to be important. We feel that same way about cyber conflict. It's going to be important in the next big war, whether it's between nation states or religions or peoples. But you've really helped us wonderfully. This is a small gift. Thank you for bringing your ideas. I can promise you this, that we're working on the leadership part. you talked about. And this room is full of former leaders and future leaders.
All with mustaches.
No, we are diverse and we're working on it. Thank you very much for your comments and your thoughts tonight.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.